I'm about to read the opening 3 chapters from Kingdom of Dragons, the start of a new fantasy series about 2 young dragon riders struggling to find their place in a world of warring kingdoms and dangerous secrets. Zora has dreamed of revenge ever since a sun warden murdered her father. When she saves a town from bandits alongside her fellow rangers and discovers a dragon egg, she might finally get her chance. After dragons killed Rovan's best friend, he vowed to destroy them all. Apprenticing himself to a sun warden, he steals a dragon egg and infiltrates Elysium, the floating academy of the dragon riders, to destroy it from within. But as Zora and Rovan train their dragons, master new magic, and grow closer together, they will question everything they once knew. When the chance comes to take their revenge, how will they deal with the weight of their past? You can find out more about the book and get a copy by clicking the link in the description down below, but for now, I hope you enjoy these opening chapters. Chapter 1. Zora. Zora fiddled with the fletching on her arrow as she watched the town below. That's a bad habit, you know. She glanced at Mudson. Her fellow apprentice ranger lay a few paces to her right, blending into the ferns thanks to the mottled brown and green pattern of his cloak. Zora raised her eyebrow. I thought you were my only bad habit. Mudson grinned. Zora tried to keep herself from smiling back. She failed, of course. That made Mudson's eyes gleam, which, if she was being honest, wasn't the worst outcome. She coughed, trying to focus on the town below, not on the curl of hair sticking out from Mudson's cowl, or how he still smelled like those berries she'd gathered the other day. Nope, none of that. Just the town below. They lay on a low cliff above the village of Vestralin. Master Withers had led them here a few days ago, following a rumour about the Broken Fang. It had been a slow trek. As they moved through the tropical jungle, Withers insisted on honing their stealth. She'd set herself up a few hundred paces ahead, then watched Zora and Mudson creep towards her, using their cloaks to blend into the ferns and the dirt. On just about every third attempt, Withers had grunted with annoyance. Then she'd forced them to go back and redo the stretch. It made for slow going. Zora still wasn't used to Tressel's sweat-inducing humidity, even after months of being posted here on this island. But as Withers was so fond of saying, fast is slow, and slow is fast. Besides, after 2 years of training under Withers, Zora was used to the Rangers' tedious exercises. People think Rangers just shoot arrows or steal things, Withers had said. But it's not about that. It's about patience. This mission was no exception. Despite the townspeople going about their usual work, it had only taken moments to confirm the presence of the Broken Fang. Their mark scarred the door of Vestralin's biggest house. Still, Withers made them watch for days. She'd asked Zora and Rovan to report their observations. How many members of the Broken Fang were there? What weapons did they have? How were the villagers behaving towards them? At first, Zora had itched to rain arrows down on Vestralin. The Broken Fang had spread chaos through Alatia ever since the end of the Dursine War. They'd raided farms, robbed travellers, and attacked villagers, all because of their mad hatred towards the dragon riders who kept Alatia safe. It felt wrong to see them parade so blatantly through a town in one of Alatia's closest nations. But as Zora watched for painstaking hour after painstaking hour, she had to admit that Withers knew what she was doing. Like Withers always said, Rangers didn't rely on luck. They relied on skill and preparation and patience. And now, Zora felt like she knew the 6 members of the Broken Fang better than they knew themselves. What do you think they're building? Mudson asked. Yesterday, the Broken Fang had carried piles of lumber into the village square. Today, they'd spent all morning making a raised platform. A raven circled the sky above, watching them work. You remember Oskin? Zora asked. Mudson rubbed his neck, wincing. Painfully so. Well, it looks like that stage where they almost hung you. You make it sound like you weren't next in line. I'm too pretty to hang. Clearly that's not what the bandits thought. Zora slapped his shoulder in mock outrage. You take that back, Mudson caller. He smiled. Or what? Zora leaned closer to him and lowered her voice. Or are you lovebirds done shouting your mating calls? Mudson flinched and Zora stifled a yelp. They turned. Withers crouched a half-dozen paces behind them, frowning. With her ranger's cloak wrapped around her, she was just about invisible against the backdrop of the jungle. Sorry, Withers, said Zora. We didn't hear you coming. No wonder, the ranger shook her head. It's a miracle you can hear anything over the racket you're making. We've kept our voices down, Mudson mumbled. Not enough. Come on, away from the cliff. Zora and Mudson crawled backwards. Once they were away from the ridgeline, they stood and followed Withers deeper into the forest. The soil was slightly springy underfoot, and a rich petrichor filled the air, the lingering remnant of a fine misted rain that had sprinkled through the jungle earlier today. Slipping between a dense patch of towering ferns, they emerged in the clearing where they'd made camp. Their tents were rolled up and fastened atop their bags. Withers made them pack every morning. You never knew when you needed to move, she'd said. Zora, Withers said, tell me the town's layout. Zora grabbed a stick and sketched a rough plan in the dirt. 53 houses made from logs with mud daubed over the walls and ferns laid on top of each other for the roof. The Broken Fang's house is right beside the village square. From the cliff you can see the front door. It's got 4 windows, but they've all been shuttered. All 6 members of the Broken Fang stay inside. Withers nodded. Mudson, what's around the village? Mudson took the stick from Zora and scratched new markings in the ground. There's a stream to the south and cliffs to the northeast. Forest goes out in the other directions, densest towards the northwest. Out to the southwest, there's a road through the forest which opens up to farmlands a half-league away. Withers grunted. Not bad. Zora and Mudson grinned at each other. Coming from Withers, that was high praise. Don't get too happy, said Withers. You're still missing a host of important details. Like this. There's not 6 fangs in Vestralin. There's 7. Zora frowned. But we've been watching for 3 days, and you've only seen 6 walking around the village, yes. But that whole time, we've never been inside their house. Mudson's head tilted to the side. The cubs. Withers nodded. There's my boy. Zora glanced at Mudson. What cups? This morning I saw one of the villagers take a tray of drinks into the house, he said. There were 7 cups. I thought it was weird, but I only realized what it means now. So who's the 7th? Asked Zora. And how come they haven't come out? I don't know, said Withers, but I'm guessing it has to do with that stage, which looks like it'll be done soon. Now, we've observed this town long enough. The villagers are acting cordial to the Broken Fang, but they're clearly unwelcome. So we'll take positions around the town. Mudson on the cliff, Zora in that tree to the south, the one you were up yesterday. I'll get in closer on the ground, 100 paces from the village's edge, with a line of sight to the stage. When people build stages, it's because they want to talk. So if they all gather there later today, all 7 of them, that's when we strike. Chapter 2. Rovan. Rovan knelt on the sand, head bowed. The sun hammered down on his bare back, and drum beats thumped through the air. Soft, for now, but growing louder. Here's where your run ends, Nightborn, whispered Cameron beside him. Rovan didn't turn, didn't respond. Talking was forbidden during this part of the ritual, and Cameron should know that. Still, it was no surprise. Ever since he'd become an initiate a decade ago, he'd always been sneered at. Without their dawn-born births, he'd needed to work twice as hard to prove himself. It didn't help that his lighter skin made him look more like a pale Elatian than an olive-toned Dursine man. Perhaps some initiates would resent the added burden. He'd seen people leave for lesser reasons. Yet Rovan had always accepted the slights. Dursine needed order, stability. The other initiates were right to distrust him. As Dawnborns, they'd prepared for this their entire lives, and Sol the Returned had ordained their paths long before birth. Rovan's path had been far more winding. Only through the grace of Sol the Ascendant had he escaped the slums of Malakan and come to kneel here today. He closed his eyes. Taking a deep breath, he focused on the sun against his skin and the grains of sand pressing against his knees. 10 years of training, and it all came down to this. Ika's face flashed before him. Rovan swallowed. He reached into his pocket to feel the reassuring coldness of Ika's tiny stone eagle. He probably should have left the totem back in his quarters. But on today, of all days, that didn't feel right. Sell the Ascendant, he prayed. Give me the courage to honor him. Raise your gaze, initiates, said a voice. The voice was deep and effortless. Rovan looked up. So did the 24 initiates crouching beside him. They all knelt on a large, square expanse of gleaming sand. High stone walls boxed around the square, and terraced seats led away into the shadows, filled with thousands of silent, white-cloaked priests. A square hole punched through the temple's roof, exposing the blindingly blue sky above. The hole perfectly matched the expanse of sand below. With the sun directly overhead, no shadows fell on the proving ground. With a flash of golden light, Emperor Eridan Farbinder appeared before the initiates. His eyes glowed with deadly radiance, bright enough to make Rovan squint. Gold embroidery lined the Emperor's crisp white jacket. Beneath, hard-packed muscles strained against the fabric, and thick, cord-like veins ran along his bulging forearms. In his right hand, he held a sunblade. A shiver ran up Rovan's spine. No matter how many times he saw a sunblade, the sight always left him awestruck. The golden blade gleamed and glittered, even in the brightness of day. It was a creation of pure light, as if the molten sun itself had been hammered into the guise of a sword. Rovan felt a thrill of fear, mingled with admiration. He'd been training under Eredin and the other Sun Wardens for what felt like a lifetime, but he doubted he'd ever have the Emperor's look of effortless, deadly presence. Rovan and the other initiates all bowed their heads to the sand. "Emperor," they murmured. Eredin acknowledged their bows with a slight nod. From the stands, the priests repeated their homage. Rovan sucked in another deep breath, trying to settle his nerves. When Alatia's dragons attacked Melokhan a decade ago, Eredin had saved him. Back then, Eredin had been merely a Sun Warden. Yet, less than a year later, the Dragon War had seen Eredin rise to become Dursine's emperor. Surely that was a sign of Sol's blessing, right? Surely that meant Rovan was worthy of apprenticeship, no matter the lowness of his nightborn birth? Rovan licked his lips. One way or another, Sol would shine his light upon the truth today. "Initiates," said Eredin, "you have reached the final stage of the trials. Pass this test, and you will become a Sun Warden's apprentice." Energy surged through Rovan. He curled his toes into the sand and took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. Soldiers marched out from a dark opening in the far wall, one soldier for each initiate. Each held 2 wooden training swords. A red sash dangled from their belts. The soldiers gave one sword to every initiate. Rovan accepted his with a nod of thanks. The soldiers assembled behind Eredin, forming a line that stretched across the proving ground. Rovan surveyed them, looking for weaknesses. None of these soldiers were Sun Wardens, but judging by their easy stances and battle-hardened physiques, they'd seen their fair share of combat. To progress, you must take a sash from a soldier and exit the proving ground. Eredin pointed at the dark passageway on the far side of the arena. All participants may strike with full force, and before we begin, I will give you a sun touch. Beside Rovan, Cameron and the other initiates stiffened. Rovan gulped. He'd never felt a sun touch before. It was an aspect honed by only a half-dozen Sun Wardens, and it was a power used almost solely for executions. If you were sun-touched, the effects of the sun's rays would grow slowly magnified until the heat crackled your skin, boiled your eyes, and burned your body to a husk. Rovan had seen blasphemers and criminals killed with the sun touch before, and it was always a horrible sight. He winced, trying to focus. What was the antidote to the sun touch? It was one of the rarer aspects a Sun Warden could develop, but he'd been reading about this just the other day. Rovan glanced at the shadowy passageway leading out of the proving ground. Shadows. That was it. Submerge yourself in enough darkness and it would break the sun touch. But with that hole in the roof, there were no shadows in the arena, and between Rovan and the tunnel stood a line of soldiers. Eredin's gaze swept across the initiates. As with all of your training, you may leave at any time. Rovan ignored the words. Ever since the dragons came, he'd only ever had one path for his future. Ridicule hadn't dented his ambition, pain hadn't diminished his drive, and no fear would douse his pursuit of justice for Riker. 2 initiates rose and shuffled out of the proving ground with their heads hung low. Rovan watched them leave. He didn't care much for Mandel, but Yaren had been one of his few friends over the past years. Rovan looked down at his fist planted in the sand. No time for grief. If Sol the Revealed chose to not bless Yaren, then so be it. Besides, Yaren was from a Dawnborn family, and still had a good life ahead. If Rovan left, he'd have no such guarantee. Once you have all received the sun touch, the trial will start, said Eredin. May Sol the Returned bless you. He took a vial from his jacket and drank the elixir within. A flash of luminescent green glowed from the liquid. Eredin pocketed the now empty vial. He strode before the kneeling initiates, tapping their foreheads. As he approached, Rovan felt the heat of Eredin's sunblade. He closed his eyes as Eredin's finger touched his skin. A tickling sensation crawled over his face. Heat surged through his flesh. It was as if the clouds had parted on a hot day, letting the sun's full force bear down on him. But he knew the heat would only worsen. Begin. Rovan opened his eyes. He stood, holding the wooden sword low at his side. Without rushing, he paced towards the line of soldiers, feeling the sand crunch under his feet. The other initiates strode beside him. Up in the stands, the drums started up again, a low rhythmic pounding, growing louder with each moment. Sweat streaked down Rovan's shaved head. Everything seemed brighter, the sunlight harsher. Dryness filled his mouth. Swords clashed as the first initiates attacked the soldiers. Rovan shrugged to loosen his muscles. He raised the point of his wooden blade to an attack position and fell into that state of relaxed, focused alertness where he was aware of everything around him, of Cameron on his right, another initiate on his left, the firmness of the sand beneath his bare feet, while also focusing on just one thing: the soldier before him. The soldier with the red sash that Rovan needed to pass this test. Rovan feinted low, then stabbed in high, but the soldier reacted with blinding speed, blocking the blow and slamming his shoulder into Rovan's chest. Rovan stumbled backwards, almost falling on the sand. On his right, Cameron's backswing sent his sword cracking into Rovan's ribs. Rovan staggered aside, gasping. Pain flared through him. He glared at Cameron. The boy was the best swordsman out of all the initiates. A blow that wayward was no accident. But Cameron just kept staring fixedly ahead at his opponent. Cameron's sword locked onto the soldier's. With an easy flick, he spun the soldier's sword into the air. It landed in a thump, just beside Rovan's foot. Another blow from Cameron clacked against the soldier's head, knocking him down. Cameron grabbed the soldier's sash and sprinted for the exit without so much as a backward glance at Rovan. Rovan gritted his teeth, trying to refocus. His ribs pulsed with pain. One was probably cracked, but he had no time to recover because the sun grew hotter with every breath. Rovan lunged. The soldier deflected his strike and clacked his hilt against Rovan's jaw. Light exploded behind Rovan's eyes. He fell backwards, gasping. His jaw throbbed with agony, and blood dripped from his mouth, splattering onto the sand. He squinted up at the soldier. The sun was so bright now that he could barely see. The man strode in, closing the distance with measured strides. Rovan shuffled back. His hand brushed against the sword dropped by Cameron's opponent. Rovan licked his bloodied lips. They were cracked and painful, already turned dry by the crushing heat. Sweat coated his torso. He tried to swallow, but all the saliva had been stolen from his mouth. He sprung up and hurled his sword at the approaching soldier. The man raised his hands to block the spinning blade, and the sword bounced off his forearms. But that just blocked his view, letting Rovan swing the other sword at his chest, winding him. The soldier went down with a muffled whoop. Rovan yanked his red sash. Panting, he lumbered towards the exit. All around him, bodies lay on the blood-speckled sand. Fallen initiates, fallen soldiers. Priests scurried around the sand, dragging them away. The lucky ones only had broken bones, but the heat and the blades had reduced several initiates to unmoving, unbreathing bodies that sizzled and crackled as they lay sprawled on the ground. Dimly, Rovan could feel the back of his own neck blistering from the heat. He grunted. The sand was practically boiling the water from his eyes. He squinted more and kept hobbling towards the exit. 20 paces to go. 15. 10. 5. A sword crunched into his ankle, sending him tripping. He slammed into the ground. Sand sprayed into the air and he tasted more in his mouth, coarse and gritty. Someone tried to tug the red sash from his hand. He held on, grunting. A boot slammed into his chest, knocking the wind from him, and his grip loosened. The sash tore free. He flailed, trying to grab his attacker, but he just grasped empty air. He rolled over and stumbled up, wiping sand from his eyes. An initiate stood a few paces away. Blood trickled down from his scalp, but a mad grin gleamed on his sweaty face. He waved at Rovan with the sash, then he stepped into the shadowy passage, vanishing into darkness. Rovan's breath came in hot, aching pants. The very air scalded his throat. It took a mighty effort to stop himself from cursing. He'd been just moments away from passing the test, but now he wiped sweat from his forehead and gazed at the exit. 5 more steps. 5 more steps and this horrible blistering heat would stop. Drumbeats thudded in his ears, rumbled in his chest. His legs wobbled. 5 more steps. He thought of Malakan. He thought of Ica. And he thought of the fire rolling down from the dragon, setting the sky alight, turning the city into a roaring inferno and filling the air with ash and screams. Rovan glanced back. Over in the middle of the proving ground, a few last initiates fought desperate, scrappy battles against the soldiers. 2 of them were rolling in the sand, wrestling. Between the sand in his eyes and the blistering sun, Rovan was almost blind, but his vision worked well enough to see the red sashes dangling from the soldiers' belts. Rovan grit his teeth. He took one last glance at the beckoning shadows, then turned and shambled back towards the soldiers, gasping as he ran, wincing as the sun burned his skin. His legs collapsed. He ploughed into the sand, yelping, bit his tongue, tasted more blood. He tried to stand, tried to keep crawling, but the heat pounded him down like a hammer in the back. He sobbed. Through a haze of blinding sunlight, he glimpsed Eridan sitting up in the stands. The Emperor watched with an inscrutable expression. Shame filled Rovan. Eridan had taken a chance on him. He'd given Rovan an opportunity that was only meant for Dawnborns, a chance to rise above his Nightborn birth. And Rovan had failed him. His head collapsed onto the sand. Darkness swept in from the corners of his vision, and then everything went black. Chapter 3. Zora. As the sun inched towards its peak, Zora leaned back against the tree trunk, wincing. Sitting on a branch 30 feet up a tree wasn't exactly comfortable, and even though she'd been up here for most of yesterday, she still felt exposed. Sure, she was mostly hidden by the leaves, yet if someone just looked up at her for more than a moment, they'd surely see. But as she sat in the tree, no one saw her. Her only visitor was that bird from before, the one who'd been circling above the village square, but even he barely glanced at her as he glided past. Down in the village, no one looked up. People seldom did. Even if they did, the cloak and her stillness would keep her hidden. Trust the cloak. Trust the stillness. That's what Withers had drummed into her and Mudson, over and over again. Zora looked at the cliff. She let her eyes go unfocused so that her peripheral vision would pick up on any movement. Her vantage point was much higher than the cliff, so she should be able to see Mudson, but she couldn't. He wore the cloak well. Down in the village, one of the Broken Fang men dropped his hammer with a thump. "Platform's ready," he called. "Let's round 'em up." His 5 accomplices, 3 more men, 2 women, rose from a nearby table. One of the women jumped onto the stage. The others unsheathed swords, readied cudgels, and picked up axes. "Everyone in the village square," shouted the woman. "Now! Don't keep Valith waiting." Zora tilted her head to the side. Valith? That was a strange name. Was that the last Broken Fang member? The one who'd been inside the house all this time? The Broken Fang stormed through the town, shoving people towards the square. Villagers shrieked. A young boy tried to run away, but one of the men tripped him with his spear. As the boy struggled to rise, he got pummeled in the back of his head. The boy slumped to the ground. Grunting, the man dragged the boy into the square, leaving a smeared trail of dark red behind him. After that, no one else tried to run. Moving slowly, Zora picked up her bow, which had been resting on the branch before her. Would Withers choose this moment to strike? Movement flickered from the doorway to the Broken Fang's house. A tall, slender woman emerged from the shadowed entrance, draped in a dark cloak, and holding a gleaming, golden box. She must be Valith. Zora squinted. No weapons that she could see, although anything could be hidden underneath her cloak. Zora frowned. That cloak, it looked disturbingly familiar. As the woman glided along the ground, patterns shimmered across her cloak, making it hard to focus on her. Recognition struck Zora. The woman's cloak, it was like a ranger's, but with patterns crafted not by cloth and stitching, but instead by magic. Zora cast a panicked glance towards the ground. Still no sign of Withers, and up on the cliff, no sign of Mudson either. She swallowed. Surely nothing had happened to them. They were just hiding. They had to be. Valith stepped onto the stage with ethereal grace. She placed the golden box down on the timber. As she straightened up, a bitter caw split the skies, making Zora flinch. A bird swooped down to land on the woman's shoulder. Zora's heart skipped a beat. That was the same bird from before, the bird who'd circled above the square and who'd glided past her hiding spot. The bird cawed again. His tail feathers wagged in the air, except there was something wrong about the motion. Underneath the feathers, a segmented exoskeleton swayed behind the bird with a gleaming stinger at the end, like a scorpion's tail, but longer. With unerring smoothness, Valith looked up at Zora. Zora froze. Sweat streaked down her spine. The woman couldn't possibly know where she was, and yet the dark, pitiless shadows beneath the cow fixed upon her, sending panic coursing through Zora's veins. Vaelith turned back to the crowd. Zora's heart thumped in her chest. She wrapped her hands around nearby branches to stop them trembling, then took a shallow breath in and a long one out, the way her father had taught. That eased some of her nerves, but not enough. What were they dealing with? And as she thought back to the lessons Withers had taught, a single word came to her mind. Elf. Zora swallowed. No, it couldn't be that, could it? She remembered the night all too well. The three of them had been hiking along the Cloven Mountains, camped out for the evening in a cave. With a flickering campfire standing feeble heat through their numb fingers, Mudson had asked Withers for stories about dragons. This was in their early weeks of training, when Withers scarcely grunted more than a handful of sentences at once. But something about their dedication on the hike must have earned a trace of respect, because Withers had regaled them with tales of her missions, alongside Alatia's dragon riders. You know, this sounds stupid, said Mudson, but when I was a kid, no dragons came to my village. I thought they were myths, like ogres or elves. You're right about ogres, said Withers, but elves are real, all right. Best hope you never meet one. How come? Asked Zora. I met an elf once. Withers gazed into the fire. We were near Willowdale. Sheep were vanishing. The villagers thought it was wolves. Then they found boot marks and thought it was bandits. Then they found a forest clearing, with the sheep's blood scrawled in strange symbols and bones dangling from the trees. That's when they called us in. 3 rangers, 20 soldiers. We went into the woods together. When the sun rose, the elf was dead, but only 5 of us were alive to walk back to the village. Zora brought her mind back to the present. She gulped. This was bad. What was she supposed to do? Down in the village, the elf threw back the cowl of her cloak. Zora found herself leaning forward, transfixed. Even if you took the platform away, Vaelith towered a foot taller than anyone else in the village. Her face was smooth and flawless, and silky, raven black hair streamed out behind her. She had an alluring beauty, but it was a stark beauty, too. A timeless grace that cared nothing for the concerns of feeble humans. Zora pinched the back of her head, forcing herself to refocus. So what if this was an elf? Strip away the myths, and she was flesh and blood, just like her. You have been blessed. Vaelith's smooth voice rippled through the air with ease. Blessed to free Ahara from the tyranny of dragons. For too long, the riders and their beasts have ravaged the lands. They call themselves keepers of the peace. They call themselves servants of justice. But the only justice they serve is their own. Not satisfied with ruling Alatia, their tyranny has spread to your island. They're building a garrison at Silison as we speak. But they would not stop there. Soon, all of you will be forced to pay fealty to the riders, or be consumed by their flames. Zora scoffed. Surely these villagers would see through the lies. Yes, Alatia's riders were building a garrison in Silison. That was why Withers, Mudson, and Zora had been sent here, to help patrol the island and prevent any threats to the projects. But the garrison wasn't part of an invasion plan. Treacle had asked for riders to protect them against the pirates and sea monsters who'd grown increasingly bold in their coastal attacks. Treacle was a small island nation with limited resources. They didn't have the military might to secure their coastlines, and so they'd asked for Alatia's help. Zora's gaze roved across the terrain outside the village. Still no sign of Withers. What was she waiting for? With Vaelith standing on the stage and the Broken Fang arrayed around the square, wasn't this the perfect time to strike? Rejoice, said the elf. Your weakness ends today. No longer must you cower from the riders and their dragons, for today you reclaim your destiny. Vaelith opened the golden box. Blue light shone onto the square, and awed gasps sounded from the villagers. Zora frowned. What was inside? From up in the branches, she couldn't see. Presuming Withers was approaching the town from the direction they'd planned, she wasn't angled right to see it, either. Only Mudson might have a chance from his position up on the cliff. I will need a child, said Vaelith. A brave child. A strong child. A child willing to lead Treacle to glory. A bowstring slapped against leather. An arrow shot into the square, flashing towards the elf's head, and Vaelith caught it. Shit, said Zora. She looked outside the town. A faint hint of movement flickered from the left side. Was that the breeze, or was Withers going back to ground after launching the arrow? I was wondering when our guests would announce themselves. Vaelith inspected the arrow, then snapped it with one hand. An Alatian ranger. find them. I'll handle the ceremony myself. I hope you enjoyed those opening chapters from Kingdom of Dragons. To see how the story continues, click the link in the description down below, or head on over to jedherne.com/Kingdom of Dragons.